And the person that is going to start our presentation today knows exactly what that looks like. They are the chair of the Uhuru Solidarity Movement in Portland. They are the chair of the USM Tours and Speakers Bureau. That's a lot of words. They are the chair of the Western region of the Uhuru Solidarity Movement, and they are a phenomenal speaker, a phenomenal individual who has taken a historic stance of reparations to African people, lives it out all day, every day. Was just marching a couple days ago, and it was so powerful to see this campaign being brought to the parades in Portland. So without further ado, it's my honor to introduce my comrade, Mads Ambrose. Uhuru.
Thank you, Jesse, for that introduction and that overview. Jesse really hit on a lot of points that we're going to be repeating and going deeper into. So I really appreciate you just kind of laying it all out there. And I just also want to appreciate the USM Seattle and Spokane for hosting this event and doing a lot of really great work. There's a lot of people behind this, and I just really, really appreciate all you comrades so much for carrying out the work despite time, and you have other things going on. Just a lot of revolutionary love for you all. So if you want to go to the next slide, I'm also going to talk about the principles of unity. We'll repeat ourselves a little bit. And so USM, the Uhuru Solidarity Movement, is an organization of mostly white people that was actually formed by the African People's Socialist Party. So we did not form ourselves. We were formed by African revolutionaries as a strategy to go into the white community and to talk about Black power and reparations. And so, and we win reparations to the economic institutions and political campaigns and community work of the African People's Socialist Party. And the 3 principles of unity is what makes you a member. So if you unite with the principles of unity, you can become a member, a sustainer. And any question that comes up, we usually can look to these 3 principles of unity to tell us, whether we're being accountable to the African working class. So one's that we're under the leadership of the African People's Socialist Party, so we have a little thing in the organization called democratic centralism that keeps the centralized leadership of the African working class. So, everything that we do is we write reports, we keep accountable to our leadership. We stand in solidarity with African self-determination. This is no question, we don't waver on this subject. It's an unconditional solidarity with African self-determination, which means African people are leading their own struggle. We know that African people have to lead the African Revolution. We can't do that as colonizers. And we organize in the white community for reparations to African people, so it is our responsibility and it is in our interest to organize our own people, white people, to this stance of Black power. All right, next slide. I'm also going to do some salutes as well, something that we do in the movement, again, to just, commemorate our leadership, which this is a very historic movement that was founded in 1972 by Chairman Omali Yeshitela. And he also created the theory African internationalism, and it's also a developing theory that the party develops and the chairman develops, and we'll be talking a lot about African internationalism today. And this theory is actually being adopted at a very rapid rate. Since the chairman was invited by Oxford University to debate about African Union, we're seeing African people all over the world, wherever they've been forcibly dispersed, saying that the chairman is the leader of the African Revolution, an African inside the borders of the U.S. And that also other colonized communities are like Union del Barrio is indigenous and Mexican people who say that the chairman has inspired them and their theory of how to liberate themselves from parasitic capitalism. So it's really, African internationalism is a call and is a strategic theory to bring about the revolution and to carry out the revolution for real, in the real world. And this is not a theory that we as white people could come up with, because but we are able to unite with it only because of the work of the chairman and African People's Socialist Party, who created our organizations and said, all right, you want to be in solidarity, here's what it means. And so that's why I'm able to talk about this today. So everything that I'm talking about today is because of the work of the chairman, because of the work of the African People's Socialist Party. It is not something I came up with on my own at all. I also, next slide, want to salute Deputy Chair Ona Zanea Shatella, who carries out the economic work, and you'll be hearing more about the Black Power Blueprint, which she leads, and that is happening a lot of different places, but definitely in St. Louis. The party went there after the Ferguson Rebellion and are still there building self-determination for the Black working class. They're right there in, in the grips of the African working class, living in, food deserts, and their houses are crumbling and they're rebuilding there, and you'll see more of that later on in the presentation. Okay, and then I also want to salute the chairwoman Penny Hess, who she went to the very first meeting of the African People's Socialist Party that called on white solidarity in 1976. So she went to the very first meeting and then devoted her entire life to reparations to African people and has since been under their leadership. So I definitely want to salute Penny Hess, and then my direct leadership, Chair Jesse Neville. And I want to also salute the African People's Socialist Party members in the room today, Israel Finn, and Demetrius was just here, Demetrius Cooper, who is also a member of the African People's Socialist Party. Salute to you, Chair, or to Demetrius. All right. All right. I'll do the next slide, please. So, all white people owe reparations to African people. This is the basis of the Uhuru Solidarity Movement. It's what drives our work, that even as LGBTQIA people or working class people or people with disabilities, if we are white, we owe reparations to African people. And this is because any of the rights or any of the resources that we have to come at the expense of the African working class. That's how the system works right now. We're on stolen land, so anything that we do, there's no justice on stolen land. And, I know many of you are here today because you're sick of being in the system and you're sick of living in this world, and you want to be on the right side of history, and we are going to be able to talk about what you can do, and one of the things is paying reparations, and this is a reparations event, we are raising reparations, so you'll be able to support the self-determination projects of the African People's Socialist Party, also sign up to volunteer and things like that. Next slide. Okay, so a little bit more about the history of the African People's Socialist Party. So, the African People's Socialist Party has no interest in oppressing anyone but to liberate the world from parasitic capitalism and end colonialism. And, the party is leading this international struggle to liberate Africa and African people from the grips of U.S. imperialism and colonial domination. And African internationalism states that the first commodity of capitalism was African human beings. So this is why we understand capitalism to be parasitic, is because in order for it to function, it has to literally suck the life out of African people, Africa as a continent, and as well as the indigenous people, indigenous land, and other colonized people around the world. That's why we call it parasitic, and you'll hear that again and again, parasitic capitalism. And so in order to overturn capitalism, you have to overturn colonialism. And this is achieved when African people and indigenous people and all colonized people have power over their own lives, they have control over their own land and resources, and control of their own government. And this is the goal of the Black Power movement, is to create this world where no one has to live at the expense of anyone else, because it is the Black working class that has been the basis of life since the assault on Africa. And, that's why we say the African People's Socialist Party, that's why they proudly state that they have no interest in oppressing anyone. They are taking all oppressed peoples with them. And if we don't have the African working class as our leadership, as our central focus, then we will be missing the interests of the African working class. And so this includes the oppression of gender and sexuality people, which is why we have a whole campaign called No Pride in Genocide, White LGBTQI Solidarity with Black Power, because we understand that we are struggling, even us as white people, LGBT people, we are struggling under this system, and that, the African People's Socialist Party is saying that this is the movement that if you want to see the real liberation of, LGBTQIA people, it is in the Black Power movement. So, I just really salute the party. And this is, we're just calling for the fact that this is a new beginning. Like, we are not going to make the same mistakes that we did in the past of being opportunistic, like Jesse was kind of mentioning, that this is really a historic time, the first time that white people in the Northwest, Portland just had we marched in the Trans March and the Dyke March, and I was like, this is a really historic moment, because never in the Trans March, Dyke March, and Pride has there been white people under the leadership of the African Revolution chanting white queers for black power, white dykes for black power, and it was very, very, poignant. Ooh. And we had a little bit of callback with our friends that, they hear us say, white dykes for black power, white dykes for black power. We say that for a few minutes. And someone else would say, trans power, and genderqueer power, and dyke power. And we'd say, white dykes for black power, white dykes. And that just represented this shift that is happening because of the work of the African People's Socialist Party saying, they do want us to have power. We do want to have power over our own lives. But it can't happen in this system. The power has to be given to black and African and indigenous people and colonized people. And I'm going to go more into all of that as well. So next slide. So this is a little bit of history. So in the 1960s, revolution was the main trend, and that's the chairman. So the chairman, I think he was 21 years old, in the middle there with the sunglasses. He was a part of the 1960s revolution. And this was a time when revolution was the main trend. Black power struggle within the U.S. inspired uprisings all over the world. So you couldn't miss people talking about black power, and you couldn't, turn on the TV without hearing about black liberation. And this was inspired, and the African people in the United States were inspiring revolution and uprisings all over the world at this time. And this includes within our sectors, the LGBTQI movement. It inspired us as well. But what had happened is, it became, almost like a mainstream thing, main trend, revolution. Well, the government couldn't have that right, because revolution means that the government that's standing right now has to be destroyed. And so what they did was destroy the Black Power movement. And they did that with COINTELPRO, which is the counterintelligence program that was carried out by the United States government. And its whole purpose was to destroy black self-determination. And this happened through assassinating the leaders, like 21-year-old Fred Hampton was shot in his bed sitting next to his wife. They're incarcerated many leaders and people involved and people associated with the Black Power movement, and some are still in prison today if they hadn't passed away there already. And they placed drugs in the black community, crack cocaine. They proved that the CIA put that in the community, and they did that strategically to separate, the African nation from organizing and uprising. And the, police occupation and containment wherever Africans are throughout the world. And we know that this hasn't ended, and that these actions are still being carried out by the U.S. government against black people, because black people will not stop organizing for their freedom. And so in the 1960s, revolution was the main trend, popularized by the self-determination of African people. And like I said, this inspired action all over the world. And so, but after COINTELPRO was carried out, just the destruction of these movements, through their ashes came, white people rising up now for, gay liberation and women's liberation. And this they left behind the struggle of black power for their own interests, and because of that, it has to come at the expense of the black community. Next slide. So really, we as white LGBTQI people, we were inspired by black people who were not afraid to be themselves. We were seeing, at the time, we were okay with being in underground bars and having sex in the middle of the night in the park, which that's cool if you still do that, but we were hiding and we were ashamed of who we were, and we were, might have had the resources to have, the mob, hide us in the basement from the cops and things like that. But when we saw black people marching on the street, not being afraid of who they were, we thought hey, that's a great idea. We should do that too. And that is when you see the gay liberation movement starts, is after, during this time. And, instead of uniting with, this anti-colonial perspective, this anti-capitalist perspective, this socialist perspective is what the Black Power movement was in the 1960s. We united with, having equal rights with the oppressor. And one of the things that you can see too, just as an example, is the co-option of the language. So, there was Black power, and then you have gay power. There was Black liberation, and then there's gay liberation. Black is beautiful became gay is good. And then the Black Power fist, which definitely originated in the Black Power movement, was co-opted, still being co-opted. It became a white fist, and they put a female symbol around it, and you'll still see that being used in women's and feminist movements today. And at the same time, I want to point out that there was a sense of liberation, and that's because of the Black liberation movement. That there was something to be liberated from, and even some of the opportunist movements still had, a sense of revolution to them, even though it wasn't under leadership of the African working class. But now you don't hear about liberation, you hear about rights. I want my rights, and that's a rights in the system. So, and in this system, it has to be equal rights with the oppressor, is when we're talking about rights. And, next slide. So we have to fight, when we're fighting for our rights, we're fighting at the expense of the rest of the world. We use the momentum of the African liberation movement to fight for our rights to be gay CEOs and gay cops. So that's why you see, this total unity with the rainbow flag and cop cars, and the U.S. imperialist flag is being flown next to the rainbow flag, and people are, think this is something to celebrate, and Pride has become the celebration, and it's the celebration because of its successes. So it's succeeded in lining ourselves, with U.S. imperialism and parasitic capitalism, and this is why most cities' prides are sponsored by banks, and they have the cop cars raising the rainbow flag, and we as white LGBTQI people are supposed to come down and just feel all of this good feelings of being accepted, and we can march half naked down the street, just so proud of who we are. But Black people, African people, no matter who they are, no matter where they are, they cannot walk down the street and feel accepted and safe no matter where they are. So that's just something that's just, the celebration is really just celebrating our successes in, uniting as the oppressor, uniting as oppressing African and Indigenous people. This year, prides all over the country are celebrating, like Jesse was saying, the 50th anniversary of Stonewall riots, and we have white gays that are marching down gentrified neighborhoods thanking Marsha P. Johnson for their rights. And, Marsha P. Johnson struggled, and Sylvia Rivera also struggled with houselessness their whole entire life. This story, we're talking about these women, and we're not talking about their contradictions of being colonized. And there's no, analysis of the fact that that uprising was an anti-colonial uprising against the police. And I just want to say, I hear a lot all cops are bad, and that, and I understand the good intentions behind that. But we have to understand that it's not just that they're bad as if it's some kind of moral question, but they are a force of colonial domination. The police is a militarized force of colonialism. And they're there to protect and defend the stolen loot and stolen property acquired by us. So they're doing it in our name as white people. And many gay-friendly cops are being celebrated during Pride, and you can see this. And it's not just co-option that we've participated in, but we've been willful participants in the real genocide of African people. Like I mentioned, gentrification. Gentrification is genocidal. It means drugs in the community. It means police containment. It means losing their resources. Houses that have been in Black families, for centuries and centuries, or decades and decades, are being, stolen from underneath their noses. Those are genocidal tactics, again, to keep the African nation separated. And we as, white queer people and trans people are often the first, we move to the hood because it's cheap and it's cool, and, We start waving the rainbow flag. Well, the rainbow flag has come to represent gentrification and the first sign of, you know, the fact that police containment is going to start happening. And there, you know, this is, if you see the word, has anybody seen the documentary Flag Wars? You should see it. It describes more about this fight of what the rainbow flag really means to the Black community. And I just also want to mention that, you know, there was a recent case, I think last year, of this white lesbian couple that lived in Portland, Oregon, where I live, and they had adopted like 6 African children who were stolen African children. And, you know, you might remember them, Dante was one of their kids that was like shoved into this photo op to hug a cop while he was crying. And it went, you know, viral after post-Ferguson Rebellion. And so they were kind of just like using this child as, you know, this liberal photo op. And then, you know, a couple of years later, you know, it turns out that Dante and his, you know, 5 brothers and sisters were being starved to death. They were being abused. And that eventually ended in, you know, the terrible death of their family driving them off of a cliff and murdering all of them. And then, you know, Ed Buck was a gay political activist who picked up Black men in bars and then murdered them. So before this, you know, happened, we, you know, as the white LGBTQ people were heralding them as some kind of progressive, you know, people in our community, and they ended up being, you know, actually, you know, physically taking African lives. And just because we're gender or sexually nonconforming doesn't mean that we get a free pass to not examine that, you know, we have many past and present crimes that we've committed against African and Indigenous people. Next slide, please. So, you know, as the system stands, our rights have to come at the expense of most of humanity. And as the chairman states, as white people, we sit on the pedestal of oppression. But just because we sit on the pedestal of oppression doesn't mean that we don't feel the, you know, effects of colonialism and the pain. And, you know, us as LGBTQIA people, we struggle with depression, and, you know, we have this emptiness sometimes that we can feel as white people because of our own self-imposed isolation. And, you know, that drives us to addiction and suicide. You know, we're not accepted by our families, and we're not allowed to express ourselves fully who we are at work. And, you know, white ruling class is gaining more and more resources and kicking us. You know, we gentrify the neighborhood and then we get kicked out. And, you know, a high-rise goes up in our neighborhood and things like that. And that basically saying that all of these things that we experience is because of white power. It's because of colonialism. So even on the, you know, on the pedestal of oppression, you know, we still experience some of that. And this is just a picture of Brandon, Tina, and Matthew Shepard, who were assaulted, very violently assaulted, and died because of being trans or gay. And again, who's at fault? White power. But you see how their stories gained, you know, so much support and attention. They had documentaries, you know, made, movies made. You know, the families received so much support and so many resources, but that's because their families were white and they had those resources and that support from the white community. And so much African and Indigenous death goes unnoticed, and business as usual, you know. And so we have to understand our oppression in the context of white power. You know, that is what we have to do. And next slide. So this is just a little example of, you know, our common enemy being colonialism, and that homophobia and transphobia is because of colonialism. It was spread throughout the world by colonialism, by white power, and that, and so we have to understand that, you know, all of these things that happen in the white community is because of white power and colonialism, which is why we say, you know, we're not just doing this to be nice to Black people. It's actually in our interest. It's actually going to see the real liberation of us, even as white LGBTQIA people. And that's why we have to join underneath the leadership of the African working class and fight this thing. And next slide. So the chairman says the white population must become anti-colonialist as a matter of self-defense. We must unite with colonized people all over the world like I said, not as charity or a do-gooder thing, but because our fate is tied to it. We have to decenter ourselves and our problems under capitalism, because we do experience those problems, like I said. It's not that we don't, but we have to see through the eyes of the colonized, which is what African internationalism does for us, and see that it is in our interest to unite with Black power. Next slide. So we don't want gay or trans imperialism, we want no imperialism. So any, gay presidential candidate from the Democratic Party should not get our support. That is just that's luring us, that's tricking us into thinking that we've gained something. And, or trying to be in the military, this fight right now that's happening, we shouldn't want to be in the military. Right. We shouldn't want to fight that is using us to fight the white ruling class's fight. We shouldn't want to go to Palestine or kill Arab children, or all of those things. That we shouldn't be tricked by this, and we know that it's not in our interest. And the African People's Socialist Party is leading this front of liberating the world from parasitic capitalism, from colonialism. And if you unite with being against the bombings of Yemen and the killing of children in Palestine and the concentration camps that are now at the border, and the concentration camps of the indigenous people that we call reservations, if you're against all of that, and you need to join Uhuru Solidarity Movement. And if this is the movement where we as white people, even as us as white LGBTQIA people, as working class white people, as white people with disabilities, as white women, as white trans people, this is our movement this is the movement that's going to liberate us. It's under the leadership of the African People's Socialist Party. And it is because the African People's Socialist Party is the front of the African working class, the most dehumanized, the most slandered, the most oppressed sector of the human population is African workers. And they will win their freedom, and they will take everyone with them who is on their side. So this is really us this is the party and us under their leadership drawing the line. You can be the white opportunist, or you can be the revolutionary cadre. And so, I just want to say, join me in uniting and taking down white power by paying reparations, joining the revolution, getting organized, and under the leadership of the African People's Socialist Party, who is not stopping till it's won. Uhuru to Africa and African people, and I'm going to say unity through, you're going to say reparations, unity through.
Reparations!
Unity through.
Reparations!
Unity through.
Reparations!
Uhuru!
Uhuru!
Feel free to clap longer and louder for Matt. It's quite all right. Thank you to our comrades for coming up from Portland to bring that brilliant message. So many things that you said that I'm sure everybody could spend another hour or two researching and learning more about, but also learning about how we can combat it. Spoiler alert, reparations. And there's just one thing that you said in there that I really want to expound on real quick, is you said gentrification, talking about flag wars, in the context of flag wars, gentrification is genocide. We don't take that lightly, that gentrification is genocide. And people will hear that and think that we're just trying to be sensational or inflammatory or something like that. It's genuine that gentrification is genocide, and it's 3 tiers of genocide. The first tier is just the theft of Duwamish land first and foremost. We are on occupied Duwamish territory, Coast Salish territory. Never were we invited, right? Never have we been given a pass to sleep here. Matter of fact, if you go just across the bridge over there to White Center, you'll see the vast majority of Native people sleeping under that White Center Plaza awning are indigenous, Native people. This is their home, but they're homeless in their own home. And if they're out on a reservation, like Matt said, it's a concentration camp. So that's one layer of genocide, stealing this from the Duwamish in the present day, stealing this from all indigenous people in the present day, whether they speak Lakota or Spanish, the party always says, it doesn't matter, stealing this territory. Number 2, the redlining that took place to force African people into all of these communities that are now being stolen, where that rainbow flag will wave to symbol gentrification is on its way, police containment's on its way. that redlining was genocide in and of itself, but then these folks made it a desirable place to be. African people find a way to make the worst parts of the food that they were given as scraps during chattel slavery, made it the best tasting food you could imagine, right? They found a way to make the places where the trash man wouldn't stop, where all the industrial waste was being poured into the air, where the water was unusable. They found a way to make that so appealing that white people would want to come steal that again. In these little places they were contained. But when that happened, guess what we did? We destroyed community. We continued to destroy the communities that were built, the reliance that African people had on each other and their neighbors, the little tiny piece of wealth they might have been able to garner from having a house there for multiple generations. And then we mixed up gangs and put them into the slum burbs, and people died and are continuing to die, whether it's through starvation, whether it's through horizontal violence that takes place after we forcibly corral people around. And what's the third layer of genocide? It's what built Seattle's tech empire, what built Seattle's military industrial complex. It is the ongoing genocide of the peoples of the Congo. If you know the history of the Congo, you know about Patrice Lumumba, you might know that the Congo has almost every resource known to humanity contained in there at massive quantities. In particular, cobalt and coltan. None of these drones work without cobalt and coltan. None of these phones work without cobalt and coltan. None of this technology, this tech empire, or this Boeing military-industrial complex empire exists without the genocide of the Congo. 10 million people over the past 10 years. And guess who has made sure that our economic interests in the colonizer nation are protected there? AFRICOM, the very same military that we are trying to, it's not just where hot war is going down. It's not just in Syria. It's not just in Iraq and Afghanistan. It is taking place in Congo. Did you know we were at war with the Congo? Did anybody know that? It's never been announced to me. Well, 4 branches of the United States government are there, and that's what the white LGBTQIA movement is trying to push folks into, is to say, we want acceptance, we want validation, we want to be able to join into this imperialist movement. And what Mads just said so beautifully, what the party teaches us is, no, we have no interest in joining this disgusting parasitic empire. We have absolutely no interest on a moral level, of course, but in terms of what Chairman just said, as a matter of self-defense, because the oppressed peoples of the world are sick and tired of white power trying to suffocate them, and they're ready to take their shit back. And they're doing it. And somebody who really embodies that is someone who we're able to hear from next, a profound speaker. Before I do that, I want to give a quick salute to Comrade Demetrius, who wasn't here when I was saluting earlier, and a salute to Comrade Marissa Martinez, both members of NPDUM, the International People's Democratic Uhuru Movement here in Seattle, which recognizes that Africans must lead. Marissa is indigenous by way of her Mexican national identity, and she understands that all colonized peoples, she's taking this historic stance that all colonized peoples' fate is under the leadership of the African working class. A major salute to you, Marissa. Extremely big salute to you, Demetrius. And then let me bring it back to our featured speaker here tonight. So this particular person, we had the privilege of hearing him speak a few months ago over in South Park at the All Diamonds or Blood Diamonds speaking tour. And that's another one of those finite resources being extracted from all over Congo. But we had the privilege to hear them speak a few months ago, and we're so thrilled that they would be able to come back here because you've heard maybe us mention St. Petersburg, Florida. I started mentioning that reparations ticket that was run 2 years ago. By the way, there's another one being run right now. Akile Anai, Director of Agitprop for APSP, is running for City Council, and so is Ann Hirsch, the Southern Regional Coordinator of the Hulu Solidarity Movement. They will win on a reparations platform in St. Petersburg, Florida, and that will be the model city for what reparations can do at a local municipal level, while something like the Black Power Blueprint, which you're going to hear more about in St. Louis and Ferguson, that is led by those who were in the Ferguson Rebellion, that some folks have forgotten about, sparked this renewed interest in revolution 5 years ago. So you're going to hear about that, but Comrade Israel Finn is working here on the West Coast to build a One Africa, One Nation marketplace, global marketplace. They are the lead organizer of the African People's Socialist Party in Portland. They work directly with Deputy Chair Onezene Yeshitela and are the economic development coordinator for the Western region of the African People's Socialist Party. Phenomenal speaker, phenomenal revolutionary, one of the people that will lead us out of this disgusting mess that we, the colonizer, have created. So without further ado, join me in welcoming Comrade Israel Finn.
Uhuru! Uhuru! All right. I just want to thank everyone for being here today, this dynamic event. I also want to thank you for having me again. As Jesse said, I was here a couple months ago for the All Diamonds, our Blood Diamonds tour. A special salute to my comrade Mads for that dynamic presentation from the Solidarity Movement. And also a salute to, what do you call it? Spokeaddle? Is that what it is? Spokeaddle, Spokane and Seattle Solidarity for organizing this event. Of course, I want to have a salute to my leadership, Chairman Amalia Shatella, for the theory of African internationalism, which we've spoken on a lot today, for which I would not be here speaking to you without this incredible scientific theory brought to you to directly talk about the way forward for the African working class, and who solved the question of same-gender loving people within the movement and staying steadfast on the stance for liberating Africans and all oppressed people, regardless of their specialized oppressed class, including gender, sexuality, disability, etc. I do want to salute my direct leadership, Deputy Chair Zenaya Shatella, for leading the economic work of the party through her office, for which I am under the leadership of. Next slide, please. I'm kind of here today, I'm an African who also identifies as queer, who also identifies as gender nonconforming. And during this month of June, where we are supposed to be celebrating some kind of identity pride with those things, I kind of asked myself, like, what are we really celebrating? What is there really to celebrate? We're in an era of the crisis of imperialism, and we see that evidence day by day, every day. We're seeing the effects, like Mads mentioned, of gentrification, which both Mads and Jesse talked about how gentrification is merely just the genocide of domestic African colonies to further white wealth. We look at the state-sanctioned violence and murder of black men, women, and children, which is just a modern-day lynching of the police state. We have the preschool to prison pipelines, drug epidemics, failing healthcare systems, and yet queer communities nationwide are being won to the pacification of the gay agenda. White LGBTQIA+ people are being lulled into this false sense of hope that if they somehow obtain equal rights with their oppressor, that their liberation will be won. But at whose expense? The imperialist colonizers are losing their stranglehold on society. It wants to maintain that stranglehold, and it must solve the contradictions that it has with the queer community in order to unite the empire. And queers are being succumbed to that every day, that bait. This is why we talk about gay rights now and not gay liberation, is because they need to unite the empire, and they're using you. Yep. They're asking you to give up solidarity with your colonized brothers and sisters to maintain your own status, and yet that status is still allocated by the state. You will never be free. Next slide. So much like in the 1960s, like we've said, the main trend on the main agenda was revolution. White leftist opportunists co-opted the narrative of Marsha P. Johnson, a revolutionary, who fought in the Stonewall riots, and they called it the gay liberation. But the gay liberation didn't exist until that day occurred. What Marsha P. Johnson was doing was enacting revolutionary practice of black power. And then, it was the LGBTQIA, white LGBTQIA people who stole that momentum and selectively took out the struggle for revolution, right? So, we don't want to continue to co-opt this movement. We want to talk about the parasiticism of queer culture. And this has been the position of queer movements as well as queer culture. Queer culture has been the conduit between black invention, African invention, and mainstream pop culture. We look at Paris is Burning, which was a documentary about black and brown, queer, and trans women in the 1980s and 1990s who were utilizing drag and ball culture as their own practice for economic self-reliance. They used this as another form outside of sex work to create their own economy so that they could survive, so that they could eat, clothe, and house themselves. And they created wealth and value out of nothing, out of fashion, out of artistry. And instead, this white woman went in and told their story and gained all the material wealth from that story. Where these same, queer and or black and brown queer and trans women, many of them still died on the streets, while their story is still being glorified, through Netflix. The same is happening today with the FX show Pose, that everybody is really excited about because it gives black and brown trans women visibility. And as much as that's important and we want to just crawl on the floor for those breadcrumbs of visibility, it doesn't have anything to do with the material conditions of the African working class and the queer and trans brown and black women that are a part of that are impoverished within that system. And yet, it's a white cis gay man who is the producer of that show who's making all the money. And so what good is your visibility if you're not getting it back? And these are the resources, directly and indirectly, that have been looted and stolen, not just from the continent of Africa, but from the African community and the contributions that they've made to the world. We are the creators of all of the wealth and value in the world. It's been off of our backs that we have the world we live in today, that white, queer, LGBTQIA people can be cops and CEOs and align with the oppressor. And so it's not just through artistic expression that these communities have created the ball culture and dance hall and all of these things. You can go to the next slide. But Madonna, next slide. Madonna, who we all know, for that infamous song Vogue, she didn't invent voguing, she didn't create voguing. In fact, she was taught by, the Harlem ball culture, and yet still when asked to have backup dancers from that culture for this momentous video, there's been reports that she didn't even treat them well, that they were in lawsuits with her because, she didn't respect the artistry from which she's, making money. And this was the best-selling single of 1990. She sold over 6 million copies. And we see today sort of the resurgence of Vogue culture, and the people that are, gaining wealth off of this, art form, are white people. They're learning from black and brown people and getting paid, taking it outside of the community and getting paid. It's actually, a class you can take at Juilliard now, right? Wow. And so this comes off of the backs of black and brown people who created this culture to survive in the first place. Next slide. So, I think that it can kind of get off track, this conversation about the appropriation of black and brown culture. I don't really care if you are going into work and saying, hey Susan, hey girl, hey, and Z snapping and back. You can do that all you want. It's about selectively taking from the black community and not putting back into the black community from which you take. So you can't take our culture and then not join us in revolution. You can't say, hey slay, and then turn around and not unite with us about feeding and clothing and housing ourselves. Right? And so it might be a cute joke, and Katy Perry might be able to say this on national television, but we want to say that solidarity is more than well wishes. I saw recently on the gram, they have this whole thing talking about Marsha P. Johnson, how she was a black trans woman, and all of these things, and if you don't support her, then you're about rainbow capitalism. Which I'm not really sure how they made that connection, but supporting black trans women isn't just saying I support black trans women. It's material solidarity. We're talking about actually changing the material conditions of our people, including the most oppressed sectors within the African nation. Next slide. So yeah, queer resistance hasn't lost its origin story. It never fully appreciated it to begin with. It's rooted in black power and revolution, and it's liberalism that has taken away as the main form of queer resistance and has stifled the blaring horns of revolution, especially from African leadership. So when you go to pride parades and you see signs like this that say, "Love wins," you know, it's really not love that is oppressing us. It's not our ability to love other people or to be outside of the gender binary that is oppressing us. It is, an economic system, an economic social system that relies on the systematic exploitation of the working class that creates this oppression. And so without that analysis, we will never be free, we will never be liberated. Love will not get you anything unless you're here for revolution. Next slide. So we're here to put revolution back on the agenda. Right? Okay, yeah. We're here to put revolution back on the agenda. It is the responsibility of the African People's Socialist Party to get African internationalism, out into the world. It's kind of a part of this tour too, to change the narrative of African people worldwide and how LGBTQIA white people play a role in that revolution. It's the struggle of the African People's Socialist Party to liberate and unite Africans, and it's the solution for every problem faced by the African nation, and consequently all other oppressed people of the world. Our problem, like Mads mentioned, is parasitic capitalism and colonial domination. You hear a lot about, Africans, same gender loving Africans in this country, but a lot of people say to me, well, what about the black community? They don't like gay people. And what about Africa? They're against gays. They're killing gays. Well, it's not the African nation that built the rhetoric against gay people. The African nation has never had a problem with gay people, with trans people. We didn't call it trans then, but we probably had our own word. But you know what I mean? It was the African nation that embraced and celebrated matriarchies and all of these things and the only reason that it exists in the black community here in the States and why it exists in Africa is because of neo-colonialist puppet heads and neo-colonialist governments that are acting as black power or white power and blackface. They're operating under the interests of the white colonizer and white power colonialism and are controlled by US imperialism. And so they're going into the continent of Africa and creating these campaigns against gay people to further their economic interests and why those economic interests are tied into the oppression and exploitation of those African workers. And I also want to deepen the idea of parasitic capitalism, because a trend that I've seen recently, especially during this Pride Month this year, is something called rainbow capitalism, which I just love that we like to make up a lot of words and have no philosophy behind them. But that's not something African internationalists do. We actually have a philosophy behind everything we do. And we're talking about parasitic capitalism because it only operates off the backs of oppressed people, and in this case, African working class people. And so, rainbow capitalism to me, when I think about what they're trying to say, is that we don't want to support Pride and the corporations that have come in and co-opted our celebration of our identities, that are only here to win our business and win our votes, which, I mean, fair, I get that. But what's really interesting is that they want you to invest in gay businesses and trans businesses and gender non-conforming businesses and put your money somewhere else other than the corporation. But that in and of itself is a co-option and an acknowledgement that what the African People's Socialist Party has been saying since day one is economic self-reliance is the cornerstone to political self-determination. And when we bring our resources back into our communities, we have economic self-reliance. We no longer rely on the state. We have dual and contending power with the state, and that we don't have to answer to them anymore. And queer people know that. That's why they talk about rainbow capitalism. We don't want you to be a rainbow capitalist. We want you to support us. And they're continuing the co-option of the 1960s by perpetuating this and not getting under the leadership of the African working class. That struggle to retain our resources and the $14.2 trillion in slave labor alone in the United States that should be returned to us needs to happen through our struggle for economic self-reliance. Yeah. So another thing that I want to talk about is I am a part of the African People's Socialist Party. And yes, socialism is in the name. We are socialists, you guys. And, I think that there was a time in this country where you even utter the word and you were blacklisted on some, government list and, exiled from the community as, terrorist or, what have you. And yet, and we now know that capitalism, parasitic capitalism, is the worst thing that has ever happened to the planet Earth.
That's right.
It's what we're fighting against, essentially. All of these issues that we've talked about before, environmental issues, women's issues, gentrification, police brutality, all of these things. This is a symptom of parasitic capitalism and colonialism. And that now, they're saying in these sort of colonial, trends, right, that most Americans, and the millennial age specifically, don't consider themselves or don't want to align with capitalism anymore. That they now feel like they want something else. Maybe they might try and dabble in a little socialism or something like that. Which, is interesting because there was a time, like Jesse said, where you said socialism or reparations and they thought you were a fringe group. You're crazy. No one's ever going to, get involved in that. And now you have imposter socialists like Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who claims to be a democratic socialism, which is an oxymoron and doesn't exist. But I mean, we have these people who are out here trying to impose these socialist campaigns of a $15 minimum wage over the course of 10 years, or other social welfare systems that will still be enacted upon the African working class community as a means of control. Your social system still allocates the money, how much you get, when you get it, and whether or not you qualify for it. And we're talking about seizing the means of production, taking back the resources that belong to us in our own hands, in our own way. We don't need the state. And similarly, like has been mentioned before, these presidential candidates are in this upcoming election cannot skate by without talking about reparations.
Yes.
It's whether or not you believe in reparations, or do you, and really it's the African People's Socialist Party that put this on the map, that really put reparations as a household concept for the mainstream American world, right? And so reparations didn't just come out of thin air. The idea didn't. It's been an idea of the African People's Socialist Party and has really been pushed since the early 1980s, by Chairman Omali Yeshitela and the APSP. And so this is why, next slide, Black Power matters. We're not just talking about Black lives, because what good are our lives if we're still oppressed? We're talking about Black Power matters. And we must struggle to unite our Black and colonized communities, to lead and organize a way forward while attacking colonialism. I think that there's, this idea that our struggle is with racism, and that that's the problem that is keeping us from uniting. But, as the chairman says, racism is just an ideology in the minds of white people. And there's nothing material about that I can fight. And what the African People's Socialist Party has taught me, and what African internationalism has taught me, is that I don't need to contend with racism if I have the means to economic self-reliance and political self-determination. I don't care whether you tolerate me or whether you like me if I have the means to control my own life. And that's what we're fighting for. I don't want tolerance. You can say whatever you want behind my back, do whatever, but I can make decisions for my own life. And that's something that we currently don't have the power to do. So yeah, it starts and ends with Africans and the continent of Africa and the working class. Our struggle, like I said, is not with white privilege. We really need material solutions to combat the material conditions of our people forced upon us by colonialism and U.S. imperialism. You can go to the next slide. So this is something that was kind of started in Philadelphia a few years ago during their Pride celebrations. The community was coming up against a lot of racism within the LGBTQI community during their Pride celebrations. So in order to be inclusive to black and brown people, that's what we love so much, they added this brown and black stripe to the Pride flag. But just in ideology alone, it seems backwards to me, because the whole idea of Pride was co-opted by the African liberation movement, and that it should be LGBTQIA people, white, brown, purple, whoever, holding up a red, black, and green flag, not a rainbow flag. We don't want inclusion into your, capitalist, colonialist movement for equal rights with the oppressor. We want to tear the system down, and you should be united with us in that. Next slide. So, it's impossible to have queer liberation without African liberation. There is no queer liberation without African liberation. No one is free until we're all free. And a big indication of this is really the economic gap, the ever-widening economic gap between white people and black people, between white LGBTQIA people and black and brown colonized people. The annual household income of black same-sex couples is as much as $24,000 less than the average income of white same-sex couples. This is, really near and dear to me. The HIV and AIDS epidemic was known as a very horrific time for the gay community, especially in the 1980s. But the epidemic is far from over for the African nation. In fact, in the U.S. alone, African women have the fastest growing rates of HIV and AIDS. Although the resources for education, prevention, and treatment are mostly accessible to, or are mostly inaccessible to the black community, and are very much focused on cis white gay men, like the Trevor Project and things like that. And in some areas of Africa, over half the population are living with HIV and AIDS, and most cases will probably end in death. They have no access to the life-saving medications that we know exists, and it is really white people that have access to those resources to obtain necessary treatment for their HIV. It's also widely known that many of the reported trans women deaths and murders in the country are African identified people and colonized people. In fact, in 2015, every single trans woman listed in 2015 reported dead was an African trans woman. And it's not much different year by year. I'd say 90% of trans women killed are African, and the rest are predominantly colonized people. And so, these are some of the, indirect ways in which there's this economic gap. But then there's also this really direct, ideology that is pumped on us by the system and by the state that, Africa is the poorest continent in the world, that, they can't, they're malnourished, they don't have food, and for $1 a day you can give an African a bowl of rice, right? But we actually know that Africa is the most resource-rich continent in the world. That's why they came 600 years ago and looted everything we've got. Africa is the most resource-rich continent, and it was white colonizers, Westerners, Europeans, who didn't invite any Africans to the table, came and dissected the continent to dictate who would colonize what section of it. To this day, your boundaries of Ghana and all of these things were dictated by the colonizer, right? And so they enslaved us. They committed the worst violence that the world has seen. They genocide indigenous Americans and sold the first commodity, which we know to be a black body, that created the rise of parasitic capitalism. The entire system was created in the trade of black skins and continues to rest on this practice today. And you see this, in the killings of black folks at the hands of the state, in the U.S. imperial prisons, which is, just another form of slavery, through the exploitation of black women's labor, the push of black folks from their communities to make way for gentrification. People have to die daily to keep capitalism alive, to keep the system going. and all the resources sustaining capitalism are being stolen from Africa, and all white people benefit from this system. The political and economic are one. That's nice. Yeah, that's what we say. The political and the economic are one. There's so little anti-colonial rhetoric that white people think that any movement is a liberation movement. We're, off of the backs of the 1960s, most of us still think that we won that battle. That the 1960s, we created tolerance and everything's all good, right? But, we're still fighting that struggle to this day. And it's not just any liberation movement or anything that claims to be a liberation movement that is going to win liberation unless it includes the struggle for the African working class, and that's right here in the African People's Socialist Party. Next slide. So I mentioned earlier that I work under the leadership of the Deputy Chair, Ona Zanea Shatilla, in her office, the Office of the Deputy Chair. And what that is really just it oversees all of the economic programs and development of the party. That's the office that everything goes through. And so, next slide. This is how the party dynamically affects the material conditions of the Black working class, and in turn all colonized and oppressed peoples through an anti-colonial economic development lens. And this isn't some, way off in the far distance, some program we might do someday. This is the work we're doing right now, that we've been doing since day one. We're creating economic institutions, economic development campaigns for the African working class, by the African working class, to dramatically affect the material conditions of our people right now. So we can't really have power over our own lives until we have dual and contending economic power. And what that means, like I mentioned earlier, is that we don't want your well wishes, we want power. We want economic power to be able to contend with the oppression we face every day by the state. And one of the ways in which we do that is through a campaign called Buy Black Power. And the Buy Black Power campaign is different than just buying black, because buying black, it still feeds into the culture of parasitic capitalism, and it has no long-term resolution for the interests of our community. You have people like, Beyonce, Jay-Z, worth like $1.6 billion. They're self-made billionaires, but what is that really doing for, the African working class in Kansas who don't have indoor plumbing? Or you have Oprah, who's going to give every white person in the audience a car, but isn't here and isn't about the African working class struggling to feed themselves.
That's right.
You have, LeBron James and Damian Lillard, who came up and are great ball players, but unless you have the talent to make it in the NBA, you are not somehow worthy of your own economic self-reliance. No. We need to invest in buying black power, not just buying black. Buying black power is, buying from each other and selling to everyone else. It's about creating, institutions that we can rely on for our everyday needs so that we don't have to buy from the corporations and from the colonizers. And it's, without this principled approach that separates this campaign. We want to seize control of the means of production, as the Black working class is the only class that creates wealth and value in the current social system and is returned to none of it. And so, as you can see here, this is an example of some of the 50 institutions that the party has created. And we have 3 nonprofit organizations. We also have developed Black Star Industries, which is an LLC that functions as kind of an umbrella for all of our economic work. We have our own media production and publication outlets, including Black Power 96.3 radio station out of St. Petersburg, Florida, and the Burning Spear newspaper, which is the longest running revolutionary newspaper in publication. I'm sure you can pick one up here later for $1. And because reporting the truth, really, of this imperialist crisis is paramount to building on political and on a political and economic front. And so, can you go to the next slide? So some of the things that I'm doing within the party is I work for I work in a committee where we're trying to create an internal bank for the party to develop African economic development programs and be able to give out microloans to these development projects without having to go through the state or without having to establish good credit under the state's, sort of imperialist reign. And this Uhuru Wabenki project will be taking off in the coming year in 2020, which is a dynamic program that has never been done before, and really taking control. Instead of having these imperialist banks where we put all our money, we can put it into our own community and really seize the means of control over our resources. Uhuru. I also work under the Black Power Blueprint, which is just a dynamic project that was born out of the Ferguson Rebellion in 2014. As Chair Jesse stated earlier, my leadership, Deputy Chair Nazane Chattel, is really the architect of this project, and it's about creating, a material difference in the lives of working class Africans right here on the ground today. And so, I actually had the chance to go to Ferguson, Missouri, when my ground was shot. I was in school at the time. I was trying to become an academic and, fight for Black power through the system. I don't know. But I saw, his death, and then consequently the death of many other Black people slain in the streets day by day through Facebook, on my Facebook feed, which I no longer use, thank God. It was troubling. As a human being, I might be African, I might be queer, but as a human being, to see death in the streets, but as an African, to see African death and disrespected, laying around for 4 hours, in the hot sun of Missouri, I couldn't focus on anything else. So I dropped out of school, and I went in a caravan with a bunch of local folks from Portland, Seattle, Spokane, to Ferguson to aid in some of the work that they were doing. And, I know that Black Lives Matter and that hashtag and that chant is so synonymous with, that movement, with the Ferguson Rebellion, but the local people in Ferguson weren't chanting Black Lives Matter. That was a co-option from the petty bourgeoisie in and of itself. The people of Ferguson were chanting, "Kill the police. Kill the police!" That's what they were chanting. And so when I got there and we went to, march and to rally, I thought we were just going to go face to face with the oppressor, with the state, with the police. And instead it was a, parade that they got, what do you call it when you get a notice you can go parade in the streets? They got a permit. They got a permit to go parade in the streets, and Al Sharpton was, FaceTimed in or whatever, and Jesse Jackson was there, and every neo-colonialist sellout that ever walked the planet was there to say, hey, I'm here, and this is what we got to do about this brother that was slain. And here we are in 2019, and where's Jesse Jackson now? Where's Al Sharpton? Where's all these people? Where's Barack Obama? None of those people give a damn about St. Louis, Missouri. They don't give a damn about West Florissant, but the party has been there ever since. The chairman saw an opportunity to come in and really raise 50 feet high the red, black, and green to symbolize that we're here to stay and that revolution is coming. And so when I went to St. Louis, but 4 years later, when I saw people raising a fist out of school buses, honking their horns down West Florissant at that flag, I know that the party is there actually doing the work. No one else is doing the work for the African working class. And so the Black Power Blueprint was born, from this rebellion, and it addresses so many things. There's so many things under this umbrella, which I believe we're going to watch a video soon. We'll talk more about it. But we're currently in stage 3 of this project. Stage 1 and 2 had a lot to do with building Aquaba Hall and the Uhuru House in St. Louis, in the mirror image of all of our Uhuru houses nationwide. We are working on the Uhuru Jiko Kitchen, which will be a commercial kitchen and cafe for African economic development projects to come in and create their food products to sell to everyone and use the commercial entities that are in there. And we also were able to demolish 2 buildings that were uninhabitable recently that we bought right on West Florissant, and we have plans to build a community garden for our One Africa One Nation marketplace and a basketball court to show that we are investing in our community, that we haven't forgotten you, that people aren't coming in to gentrify your neighborhood, that we will bring the economic development back into these neighborhoods. And so some of the ways that you can get involved, African people, we want you to get involved in the economic development work of this party, and you can do that through the NTU Volunteer Brigade. There's an ability to sign up. You can join your local chapter of Impedum, or if you are North American or white identified, I strongly urge you to join the Uhuru Solidarity Movement. You can show material solidarity with Black Power through that movement. There's many ways to get involved on any kind of volunteer level, whether you got time or you got 3 kids at home, you don't have time, but you want to just give some money, we can take that too. The Revolution takes cards as well. I've been asked to mention that. You can also subscribe to the Burning Spear YouTube channel, and one of the most dynamic political educations that I've ever experienced is live streamed every Sunday. Omali Yeshitela and the hashtag Omali Yeshitela Taught Me series will break it down for you and tell you more than I could tell you on the stage. And lastly, you can also buy the Burning Spear newspaper. It's, like I said, the longest running revolutionary newspaper, by the Black working class, by the African working class, and it's filled with articles that will blow your mind. So that's all the time I have for you today, and thank you very much.
Here's a vote for Comrade Israel Fan. Uhuru!